Hello, upper room, and welcome. I'm excited to dive into what God has for us today as we continue talking about surrender. I'm from the great state of Wisconsin, and as a young person, I was probably 15 or 16, the summer of 1999 or 2000, I finally got what I wanted for a long, long time: a horse. I lived in the middle of a farming community. The nearest neighbors were a mile away or more, and there were cows and horses and sheep and pigs, and my parents had geese and ducks and a pig and goats and chickens and cows, but I'd never had a horse of my own. And I loved horses. I thought I did. I spent all my spare time reading Black Beauty and Misty of Chincoteague and the Black Stallion books. That's what I did. I was homeschooled, reading all these books and getting another one from the library and reading the next one. And I just wanted my own horse. And finally I got one. Beautiful paint horse, named him Comanche. And that horse took up all of my time in my life. In the summertime, it was great because this horse needed exercise. And so we lived in the middle of a place called the Flambeau Flowage. And apparently a flowage is just like a place where there's a lot of water, kind of like a swamp, but it's moving a little bit. So it's not quite a river or a creek, but it's not exactly like dead swampland. But there's water everywhere. And it was beautiful. We could ride through in the summer, and there's a green, and maybe there's wild raspberries by the side of the trail, and we might see other wildlife as we're getting exercise for this horse. But in the winter, it was an entirely different story. Winters in northern Wisconsin were brutal, if you've never experienced one. And on the particular day that I'm thinking of, I knew I still needed to exercise Comanche. He had to get out and get exercise. He'd been cooped up in his stable for so long, and we just had, it was an old garage, the size of a small room, and he had room to, move around a little bit, but not enough to get exercise. And so I knew I needed to exercise him. It had been a few days, it had been bitterly cold, 30 below. And that particular day, it was probably 15 below, so it's not like it was a heat wave, but to us it felt warmer, and I knew I needed to get him out and exercise him. Now, we'd experienced several days of snow, and the plows hadn't come through on our small gravel road yet, and so I took Comanche out and rode him a quarter mile or half a mile away to an arena nearby to get some exercise. And normally we'd go into the arena and I might ride him around several times and maybe lather up a sweat and then take him back, clean him off, feed him, and he got the exercise he needed. Well, this particular day, even though I had his best in mind, I knew that he needed exercise. I knew that when we were done, I was going to clean him up and feed him and give him water and put him back in his warm stable. And we got to that arena, and Comanche had other things on his mind. He did not in any way want to submit or surrender to what I wanted to do. I hadn't wanted to take the time to saddle him up and didn't really want to make him sweat into the saddle too much because it was cold and it would feel very cold. So I just put on a halter with a rope to ride him and jumped on. And as soon as we got into the arena where he's walking through about 3-foot deep snow, Comanche kind of lost it, bucked me off, and I'm fighting with him, trying to keep him nearby. And all of a sudden he runs off, which he'd never done before. He was fighting against what I had planned for him. He didn't want to do what I wanted for him to do, and he took off running down the road, and I kind of wandered over so I could look down the road and just make sure that I could see where he went. And as I watched all the way down that road, a quarter mile away, I watched him veer off into our yard, and I started the long trudge back, which was much harder for me on 2 legs than him on his taller 4. When I finally got back to the yard, he was standing outside of his stable. He just wanted to go back in. See, we wanted, in a way, the same thing. I wanted to help him be healthy, get exercise, feed him, and get him back in that stable where he'd be warm and comfortable and safe. He wanted to be in that stable where he'd be warm and comfortable and safe. But rather than go through the hard work that I had planned for him that was better for him, he refused to submit. And if he just surrendered to what I wanted, life would have been so much better for both of us. I wanted to give him the best, but he kept fighting me. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 are some of my favorite verses. It says, "Trust in the Lord with your whole heart, and don't lean to your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, not some of what you do, not just the things that feel hard, but all you do, and he will show you the path to take. I wanted to point out to us today, as we wrap up this series on surrender, that there are a few things that keep us as humans from surrendering to the will of God. Like Comanche refused to surrender to what I had for him, even though it was the best. Number one is fear. Our fear that God's going to call us and ask us to do something maybe that we hate, that we're afraid of trying, that we're not comfortable doing. He's going to call us to sacrifice or activity or some sort of work that we are not feeling equipped and ready to do. Thomas Aquinas, a theologian who lived in the Middle Ages, said that fear causes a contraction of the soul. He compared the effects of fear to a city that's come under siege. And as the enemy army approaches, the people inside those city walls reach out, grab all the resources they can, all the water they can, all the people from outside they can, in a very inward-focused, self-focused moment, pulling themselves into the city to try and assume a defensive position to protect themselves in the best way that they can. And similarly, when we give in to fear, we tend to curl inward. That emotion of fear causes us to think only of ourselves, and we cannot surrender to the will of God because our fear is blinding us to even knowing what the will of God is, and then stopping us from sharing God's love with others. It's impossible to pursue God's will from this position of fear, or even to know what it is. Number two is our selfish desires. In 2016, in the city of Mumbai, India, there was a terrible plague going on that was causing people to die, and city officials knew they had to do something. What was the problem? Too many people were dying while taking selfies. Yeah. And this wasn't just the case in India. The Washington Post published a report that noted that hundreds of people had died taking selfies. And in that report, they indicated that the top reasons for these deaths while taking selfies in dangerous locations were a number of crazy things, including electrocution, animal attack while taking selfies, falling, people getting too close to the edge of things and falling over, automobile accidents while driving, and the number one cause of death by selfie was drowning. You see, our culture's desire in our world to be seen by others in the best possible light and to present something that makes people envious of us and jealous of what we're doing was literally killing these people. True surrender to God's will has no room for seeking the opinion of others or pursuing my own will first. In pursuing God's will and doing what He's called us to do, we find satisfaction, enjoyment, peace, fulfillment, and a reason and a purpose that even the most selfish desires being fulfilled cannot bring to us, a level of joy that can't be brought from anywhere else. Psalm 139 talks about a level of intimacy with God where He's known us since before we were born, and we can continue to pursue that with Him by seeking His will and doing it. In the Old Testament, God sent a message to His people through the prophet Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 18, if you want to look up this story, God sends Jeremiah to the house of a potter. And the potter is forming a jar or a vessel out of clay. And Jeremiah is asked to watch this potter. And as he forms it, eventually he finishes the work that he's trying to do and realizes this isn't at all what I wanted it to be. And so the potter crushes that clay, that vessel, back into wet clay so he can reform it and remold it and remake it in the image of what he wants it to be. And God says to Jeremiah, "This is my people. I am their God. I am in control. I know what is best for them. And I want you to go to them and tell them that I have a plan for them, and sometimes that plan might change, or sometimes it might not feel good, or sometimes they might have to be reshaped and reformed, but I'm calling them to surrender and follow me and pursue my will for their lives and for this nation. And Jeremiah goes to the people and he shares that message, and they stubbornly say, don't waste your breath. We will continue to live as we want to. The selfish desires of their hearts were keeping them from pursuing the will of the one who loved them more than anything. So first of all, fear can keep us from surrendering to the will of God. Secondly, selfishness and a desire to fulfill our wants and needs first. And thirdly, we see the scary piece about this issue of surrender is that flat out rebellion, in the way that we see it in this story of Jeremiah, isn't the only way, along with fear and other things, to miss God's will. Matthew 7 warns us about activity in the name of God while not pursuing the will of God. In verse 21, Jesus says, hey, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will make it into the kingdom of heaven. There will be those who have prophesied in my name and cast out demons and done many amazing things in the name of God. But in that day, when they come to the judgment, I'll say to them, depart from me. I don't know you. What's causing this? This verse says Jesus indicates the people who have an eternal presence with God, who are eternally with him, are those not just doing work in his name, but those who first pursue his will. Sometimes we struggle to surrender to the will of God for our lives because we're so wrapped up in activity in his name, good things that we think is what he wants for us. And so, to wrap up this series on the thought of surrender, what's keeping you from giving everything to God and pursuing what he wants from you? What's keeping us from surrendering in the way that Jesus did in Gethsemane, or the way that a sheep does to its shepherd? Is it fear? Is it a deep selfishness? Is it the fact that you're already engaged in religious activity that is comfortable to you and leaves you thinking, I'm doing the will of God? Don't let your life be motivated and given to activity while missing the beautiful will of the Father who loves you and has so much better for you. You remember my story that I opened with about Comanche. If he had just trusted me, his life and my life, even though in the moment it felt hard walking through that snow, would have been so much better. So too is a life lived in pursuit of the will of God, in surrender to what he wants for us. Instead of fighting him in the way Jesus called out Paul in Acts for fighting against, kicking against everything I've called you to, let's spend time saying, God, what do you have for me? What's your next step for me? How can I best pursue what you want for my life, for my family, for my community? In closing, I just want to share with you some words from an old hymn. We used to sing it all the time in church, and so it became almost a rote thing for me to hear this, and I just kind of tuned out every time I heard it. But as I was kind of reading things and looking at this idea of surrender, this song came back to my mind, and the name of it is All to Jesus I Surrender. And it goes like this: all to Jesus I surrender, all to him I freely give, just like that passage in Proverbs. I will ever love and trust him, and in his presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender all. All to thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. How can you be sure you're wholly pursuing only God's will for your life and not living from that place of inward focused fear, of self-focus, of selfishness, or of religious activity, comfort in knowing I'm doing all the things? Proverbs chapter 3, verse 6. Seek his will in all that you do, and he will show you the path to take.